Hello, my name is Kiyomi Kishaba, and this is my communication capstone presentation about the podcast that I developed this semester. I have a double major in communication and English writing, so this is actually my third capstone that I'm completing this year after completing creative nonfiction and poetry. Since I am interested in writing as an English major, I decided to create a podcast that was interviewing Asian American writers in the Puget Sound area because I wanted to learn about their journeys and where they ended up in their careers. The three writers that I interviewed were Rick Barrett, Tomiko Nomura, and Vince Schleitweiler. I know Professor Barrett because he works at PLU and teaches poetry and Asian American literature classes, and has also published several books of poetry. I met Tomiko in 2019 for my first podcast project that I completed in my multimedia production class. And I interviewed her about her work recovering Tacoma's lost Japantown. I met Vince in 2018 because he does freelance writing for the Resolute magazine and interviewed me about my faculty student research project at that time. He connected me with an editor at the International Examiner, which is an Asian American newspaper in Seattle, and I have been freelance writing for them ever since. Through the development of my podcast, interviewing Asian American writers, I utilized communication theories to develop effective deliverables. My first deliverable was creating interview questions for my three interviewees, and I used the uncertainty reduction theory to develop those questions. Uncertainty reduction theory was developed by Charles Berger and Richard Calabrese in 1975. The theory looks at the dynamic between individuals before they meet and argues that people seek information about individuals to reduce uncertainty in interactions. Uncertainty reduction theory is broken into two subsections: cognitive uncertainty and behavioral uncertainty. Cognitive uncertainty relates to the beliefs of the other individual, political affiliation, or religious beliefs, for example. Behavioral uncertainty ties to the tone of the social interaction itself and the social norms expected to be adhered to in the given situation. People seek information about an individual in different methods: passive, active, and interactive. Passive means information is learned from simply observing the other person. Active is asking other questions to people who know the person. And interactive is asking the person themselves. Prior to interviewing the writers, I engaged in active strategies to learn about them. I Googled them and learned as much as I could from their websites and LinkedIn profiles to form interview questions. I then engaged in interactive strategies by interviewing them and asking them questions about themselves. I prepared several questions having to do with the interviewees' specific accomplishments and careers. Uncertainty reduction theory goes both ways, meaning they are also trying to learn about me and my behavioral tendencies. So I decided to put the questions targeted to the interviewees after the more general questions, so they are warmed up and feel comfortable providing longer, more detailed answers. I already know Professor Barrett relatively well, so I had a lot of context to use for questions and topics that I know he enjoys talking about. On the other hand, my interaction with Vince has been limited, so my questions are based on online research and cover a broad spectrum of his work to find something he wanted to talk longer about. Since I already made the podcast with Tomiko, I was familiar with her work, but she's published 2 books since I've seen her last, so I focused my questions around those recent publications and her current involvement in activism. My second deliverable was turning in raw footage from my first 2 interviews, and I looked at the narrative paradigm theory as a way to organize the information gathered in my interviews in order to make it engaging for an audience. Walter Fisher developed the narrative paradigm communication theory in 1984. The theory claims that the most meaningful form of communication stems from the act of storytelling. Therefore, people generally receive information through the form of a story. For example, the conversation starter, "How was your day?" prompts a response that can be followed with an explanation of the day's events told chronologically, aka the story of how their day went. We were drawn to the act of storytelling because we feel invested in the characters and the events that they are affected by. When conducting my podcast interviews, I try to keep this in mind as a way to make the interviews as an interesting listen for an audience. In the narrative paradigm theory, It is important to establish credible and likable characters that the audience can connect with. In order to give the audience context of the people I was interviewing, I started off each interview with a brief biography of the writer, including where they went to school, books they have published, and other facts like where they teach or freelance. I also gave some context as to how I met the writer. For example, I met Rick Barrett through several English classes, but talked specifically about the Asian American literature course because it was most relevant to the point of the podcast. For Tomiko, I referenced the podcast I made with her a couple years ago, which was how I met her. By providing a biography and context for how I knew the writer, I showed that both I and the writer are credible characters to the audience. Another element of the narrative paradigm theory is coherence, concerning how much the narrative makes sense and can be understood by an audience. Some of my questions prompted the writer to tell a story in response, such as, do you have a specific memory of when you claimed your identity as a writer? After the initial answer to the question, I generally followed up with more questions that I had to make sure the story made sense. I decided to flesh out the story as much as possible, knowing that I could edit it to make it shorter later. Through editing in general, I created a coherent story about the writer's journey and what they are working on now. As I began the editing process, I kept the narrative paradigm theory in mind and tried to establish a storyline arc throughout the podcast. I decided to create 3 separate episodes in order to focus on each writer with intros, outros, and music to connect the other episodes. My third deliverable was a storyboard of each of my podcasts, detailing the order of the episode, intro and outro segments, music, and transitions. Max McCombs and Daniel Shaw developed the agenda setting theory during the 1968 presidential election by looking at how media campaigns influenced what the public was thinking about. Agenda setting theory argues that the media decides what is important for the public by covering some issues more than other ones. It isn't about the opinion of the public on certain topics, but rather that the public has certain topics on their mind. Since the news topic is covered so often in the media, the public easily accesses information about that topic and therefore decides that topic is an important issue. The development of the internet and social media added a new element to the agenda setting theory, internet-mediated agenda setting. In the Korean Journal of Journalism and Communication Studies, it was noted that the internet creates a reverse agenda setting where internet users can set the agenda themselves. Therefore, the internet gives the public power to influence media topics by making something go viral or grab enough attention for it to be covered by the news. My idea for my podcast was influenced by both media and public agenda setting. Violence against Asian Americans has unfortunately become a relevant news topic that has spread across tons of social media. Although my podcast is focused on the Asian American writers, each interview ended up discussing this violence and what role Asian Americans can play in ending it. I thought it was interesting that all the writers had that issue in their mind, although the podcast was focusing more on their craft. However, it does not surprise me because, as an Asian American myself, that issue has been very pressing in my life as well. As a form of media itself, my podcast participates in the agenda setting theory by presenting this topic as an issue of concern. Although the podcast will not likely reach many ears, it will still influence some audience members by being yet another reminder of the violence against Asian Americans. This shows how the agenda setting theory accurately portrays the spread of news in a way that makes some issues seem more important than others. One aspect of the agenda setting theory is framing, affecting how the media presents a topic to garner a certain reaction from the audience. I think my podcast presents a unique framing of the issue of the violence against Asian Americans by first presenting the speaker as a writer or teacher and talking about how writing interacts with their identity. This adds complexity to the audience's understanding of how Asian Americans feel right now, because the discussion is presented by 3 people who spend a significant time writing and reflecting on their own Asian American identity. I hope the podcast sheds new light on how writing as a form of remembering and a form of spreading news can both help put a stop to this violence. After a short peer review process, and minor revisions, I uploaded the episodes to SoundCloud. The link to this page is in the video description, and I encourage you to listen and learn from these 3 amazing writers. Please contact me with any comments or questions. Thank you for listening.